All right, welcome to Chapter 5. We're going to talk today about European empires in the Americas. One thing we need to think about is what historical developments enabled Europeans to carve out huge empires an ocean away from their homelands? Well, there were several things. One, boats. What they had done is they had noticed some of these people in the picture are scholars, Muslim scholars and Asian scholars, and they are the ones that had boats. And so, with some of this, they um, ended up taking those boats that gave them the opportunity to go across the ocean. They also had a desire, they had a drive to want to leave their current land and go over there. Also, disease. Disease is something that helped them set up these big empires. You know, disease for the Native Americas, to the Native Americans, basically decimated their whole society. They also had motivations for participating in empire building. They wanted to maybe spread religion or escape religious persecution. All of these were definitely something that were important. They wanted a part of that Eurasian trade without having to use the Silk Road. So again, part of their advantage was location, location, location. Geographically, the reason that they ended up in the Americas first is because they were geographically closer. So here is Europe over here, kind of where they've got the little insert. Europe is over here, and then we're right here. China, when Zheng He would have had to go all the way around and end up over here in California. And remember that Zheng He quit because after the Emperor Yongle died, they decided the resources were better off used not traveling. Disease is what also gave them some advantage. So mostly disease was in favor since the natives hadn't been exposed to a lot of the diseases that the Europeans had. A lot of them wanted to either spread religion or to escape religious persecution. That was kind of a big deal. The Spanish also had the advantage of feuding tribes. So, take for example, Doña Marina. It's a story of a woman who was sold by her mother to help her family financially, and that she ended up in the Mayan and Aztec side. She was taken by Cortez and used by the Spanish. She was very smart, spoke several languages, and helped out Cortez as far as like communicating between the tribes and the Spanish. He took her as a mistress. She bore him a son. When he didn't need her services anymore, he married her off to an officer and then took her son to Spain. The interesting thing is, he felt like he was doing her a favor by giving her to an officer, but also he took her son. So, how is this going to show any continuity of patriarchy? Well, if you think about the fact that the woman had no say in where she was, who she was with, and also she had no control over her son who was taken from her. So let's look at this map. Which European powers control the most territory in the Americas, and then which controlled the least? I think it's probably apparent that the Spanish owned the most and the Dutch owned the least, if we look at the key right here. And how does this map show the rivalry among the European states? So when we look here, we notice that there is not a gap. They went right up to each other. So they were fighting for every little square inch of land. And that shows that this rivalry was pretty strong between all of them. So what's going to happen is they're going to end up, the Europeans are going to end up, they're going to end up over here. Smallpox is going to decimate so many people. 90%, actually, if you look at Mexico, and not every area, but let's look at Mexico in particular. In 1520, they had a population of almost 22,000. Just 25 short years later, it was down to 15. And if you want to look, in 56 years, it went from 22 million to about 3 million. That's a lot. That is a large, large population of death. So
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about climate change. Mr. Green, that's not history, that's science, and also I don't think that's even happening. Yeah, two things to me from the past. One, contemporary climate change is real. Two, this isn't the first time the world has experienced disruptive climate change, believe it or not. So climate change, of course, can be a very controversial topic, at least here in the US, but we're not discussing today whether contemporary climate change is caused by human activity, although it is. We're talking about history, and history is never controversial. We know that climate change can happen because it has happened. In fact, although we're living in an age of global warming today, for most of the early modern period, the globe experienced cool temperatures. Some historians have called this the Little Ice Age, which would make a great animated movie. Someone should get on that. Anyway, good job historians giving something an evocative name for once. I'm picturing a tiny little ice ball, like a snow globe. Apparently the Earth was regular size back then. But anyway, the Little Ice Age lasted from the 13th through the 19th centuries, and it was a period when average temperatures were cooler than they are now. This doesn't mean that it was always cold, though. There were volatile shifts between bitterly cold winters and wet summers and long droughts. Also, weather conditions were not always the same in all parts of the world, kind of like how the winter of 2014 was terribly cold in the United States, but still one of the warmest on record worldwide. Climate is not weather. So we know temperatures were colder, partly because of science, but also because of history. Science has shown through the study of stuff like tree rings and ice cores that it really was colder back then. But we also know this from history. I mean, records kept at the time by monks and winemakers and others also reported cold weather and bad harvests. Bad harvests are crucial to our understanding of the Little Ice Age because they were catastrophic events, bringing hunger and, in some cases, starvation to millions of people. And because they were so catastrophic, people wrote about them, which leaves us a historical record. Less food meant more disease and also more crime. Poor harvests often led to civil unrest, especially bread riots. For some, a sensible strategy was to hit the road, or in the case of the Norsemen, hit the sea. In fact, sometime during this period, their search for better fishing grounds led them to America. And humans also proved very innovative when adapting to new climate extremes. One example near to my heart is the Netherlands, where people developed water control systems and experimented with new agricultural technology to make farms less vulnerable to terrible weather events like floods. But the Little Ice Age led to unpredictable harvests around the world, and without spam to fall back on, a couple bad harvests in a row was fatal. So the whole Little Ice Age was pretty bad, but the 17th century was the worst. Some historians even refer to it as a period of global crisis. I mean, here are just a few examples of the political instability in the 17th century. The English revolutions of 1640 and 1689, Spain's European wars and debt problems, peasant and urban worker uprisings in Italy, the fall of the Ming and the rise of the Qing dynasties in China, a succession crisis in the Ottoman Empire, wars between colonists and Native Americans that nearly destroyed Britain's colonies, the Mughal Wars of Succession, and the 30 Years' War. And that's not even to mention Shakespeare. No Little Ice Age, no Shakespeare. That's what I would argue. Totally a climate-dependent writer. I would be just as good as him if only we were in a period of climate change. Now, obviously, we can't say that all of these upheavals were caused by cooler temperatures, but they did correlate with them, and in many cases, weather contributed to them. Unrest was often linked to food shortages and taxes. The taxes were high, and the food was short because the harvests were bad. Now, for many people in the 17th century, the cause of the calamitous bad weather was obvious: human sinfulness. As Welsh historian James Howell wrote in 1647, God Almighty has a quarrel lately with all mankind, and given the reins to the ill spirit to compass the whole earth. Others blamed bad weather on witches, always a safe bet, or on natural phenomena like eclipses, earthquakes, comets, or sunspots. And they might not have been totally wrong. Well, they were totally wrong about the witches, but there were fewer recorded sunspots, especially in 1617 and 1618 when the 30 Years' War began. Oh, and there were 12 volcanic eruptions between 1638 and 1644, which produced dust veils that might have made the whole planet cooler. The weather in the middle of the 17th century, right around the time of the English Revolution, was especially bad. Like in Massachusetts, 1642 was so cold that the bay froze, while in Indonesia, the droughts caused rice harvests to fail. Much of Africa faced droughts between 1640 and 1644, and in 1643, flooding in the Low Countries was so bad that cows and chickens ended up in trees. And Scandinavia recorded its coldest winter ever in 1641. And these changes in weather were profoundly disruptive because much more than today, people depended directly on agriculture and thus the weather for their livelihoods. Let's go to the thought bubble. So, according to historian Thomas C. Smith, farming, with its allied tasks, was the principal occupation and nearly the sole source of income for most families, and its rhythms defined the annual cycle of work, rest, and worship. Severe annual variations in the harvest reverberated through family life. According to Jeffrey Parker, a fall of 2 degrees Celsius during the growing season, precisely the scale of global cooling in the 1640s, reduces rice harvest yields by between 30 and 50%. In latitudes north of the temperate zone, each fall of 0.5 degrees Celsius in mean summer temperature decreases the number of days on which crops ripen by 10%, doubles the risk of a single harvest failure, and increases the risk of a double failure sixfold. Harvest failures led to food shortages, which led to everything from stunting via malnutrition to rising food prices. A 30% reduction in the grain harvest often doubled the price of bread, whereas a 50% reduction quintupled it. And when people have to spend more on food, they don't have money to spend on other stuff, which means the people who make that other stuff are suddenly unemployed and hungry. And then hunger itself reduced the amount of available food by diminishing people's capacity to work, since a decrease from 2,500 to 2,000 calories halves our ability to work efficiently because the body's basic metabolism still requires 1,500 calories. And hungry people are also more susceptible to disease. Add together floods, droughts, harvest failures, and disease, and you get a vicious cycle leading to population decline, which is exactly what happened in the 17th century. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So all of that is pretty horrible, but human suffering in the 17th century wasn't just caused by cold and drought. There was also a lot of war going on. And these wars between and within states multiplied the effects of hunger as soldiers looted wherever they went. Like the Chinese even coined a word for soldiers' bad behavior, Bing Huo, which means soldier calamity. And then, to add injury to injury, the costs of most of these wars were borne by the peasants, who suffered doubly as their taxes went to pay for the king's wars, which brought soldier calamity. These taxes were often on staples like bread, and so they often led to bread riots, which were not great for morale. And yes, terrible weather could even contribute to the fall of dynasties. The 1641 drought in China was so bad that the Grand Canal began to dry up for the only time in history, which reduced rice shipments to China's capital. Unable to feed the people, the Ming Emperor surrendered to the Qing in 1644. Drought and cold had also encouraged the Qing to overthrow the Ming in the first place, as poor harvests in Manchuria convinced their leaders that invading China was the only way to avoid catastrophe. And then the Qing got to China and they were like, "Where's all your food?" And they were like, "Yeah, the whole planet is colder, not just Korea." But then they were already there, so they decided to have a dynasty for a while. I am your history teacher. So obviously protests and rebellions were public responses to hunger and war, but many people confronted the problem of hunger by trying to reduce the number of mouths they had to feed. They could do this by reducing the number of births through postponed marriage, or in more extreme cases, through infanticide. And the most desperate resorted to suicide. Now, we don't have many records of suicide rates, but a Qing decree of 1688 forbidding widows from killing themselves suggests that it was widespread. And speaking of widows, wars compounded the problem by creating lots of them. Like in Europe, the 30 Years' War led to a rise in the number of households headed by women. Women also took the lead in reducing the number of mouths to feed by delaying marriage. Like whenever bread prices rise, rates of marriage fall. And the last thing that I'll mention here is that bad weather and poor harvests also prompted migration. Like in the first half of the 17th century, perhaps one half of all adult Scotsmen left Scotland. Many Chinese left for the Philippines, Indonesia, and Taiwan. So we have a world that's dramatically different because of the climate change of the Little Ice Age. Women head more households, many communities are more ethnically diverse, population growth slowed dramatically, and there was widespread political unrest and wars and starvation. And of course, looking at the history of the Little Ice Age is relevant for us today as we face a changing climate and the extreme weather that comes with it. Sometimes we like to imagine that math and science don't really have much to do with the humanities, that like how we live in the world isn't really shaped by our environment. But of course it is. We are shaping our environment. Our environment is also shaping us. To end on a hopeful note, the agricultural innovations that developed in the face of tremendous weather-related challenges should remind us that it is possible to adapt to changing climates if we make the effort and take the time. We don't know what the cast iron plows of the future are going to be, but we do know that we're going to need them. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
Okay, so this is what's going on with Europe and the United States. So, like I had said, smallpox, which had accompanied the Spanish, that the Spanish had a large, not complete immunity, but they had built up some immunity. until they got here where the Native Americans did not. But this did bring about the Colombian Exchange, which was super important because the Colombian Exchange is going to bring
Heimler's history. So in Unit 4 of AP World
about the exchange of goods, which is going to impact both.
Exam in May. And if that's something you're into, then did the most bearded and the most gap-toothed. All right, enough of that. Let's talk about the Colombian Exchange. And I don't think I'm overstating it to say that the Colombian Exchange changed the world on a scale that few other events had. In the short run, the Colombian Exchange meant disaster for the natives of the Americas, but on the other hand, it meant extraordinary wealth and profitability for the Europeans. But in the long run, for all involved, the Colombian Exchange introduced new ways of life and new ways of death through the mutual sharing of the East and the West. So first of all, what is the Colombian Exchange? Well, its name comes from our good buddy Christopher Columbus, whose landing on the island of Hispaniola launched this whole exchange. But if you want a definition, it's essentially this. The Colombian Exchange is the transfer of people, animals, plants, and diseases from the east to the west and from the west to the east. So let's start with an upper. Diseases. Until Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, Afro-Eurasia and the American continents were completely isolated. And through a series of unfortunate or fortunate events, depending on how you look at it, these two worlds came crashing together. Because of this long-term separation of these two people groups, the Native Americans had no immunities to some of the more devastating European diseases. And the most devastating of the bunch was smallpox. Smallpox was an airborne disease that Europeans had been exposed to for many centuries, and even though it was still devastating, they had built up some immunity to it. But when the white people showed up in the Americas and started coughing all over the natives, the smallpox contagion was deadly to a people who had never encountered it before. It was this disease that was responsible for the large-scale death that occurred in the Americas. In general, historians estimate that it wiped out about 50% of the native population, and in some places, upwards of 80 to 90% of the native populations were destroyed. But that's not all. The more Europeans arrived in the New World, the more diseases they brought with them. They brought malaria and measles and the flu, and all of these wrought disaster on the native peoples. And in terms of its scope, you could compare it to the devastating effects of the Black Death in the former period. All right, if you're sufficiently depressed after that, let's move on to some happier matters, namely animals and food. The sharing of animals and food in the Colombian Exchange actually went both ways, from east to west and from west to east. And in many cases, these food and animals, when they were introduced into these societies, had massive effects. For example, the Europeans introduced pigs and cows and wheat and grapes into the Americas. And these food items eventually became staples of the American diet. I mean, what would we be today without beef? I mean, I know that 50% of your population is dead from smallpox, but on the upside, cheeseburgers. The Europeans also introduced horses to the Western Hemisphere, and the adoption of that animal changed the lives of the Native Americans who lived in the plains regions. After they learned to ride horses, they were able to hunt buffalo with greater efficiency, and that meant, in many cases, excess food. Also, the horse gave tribes a competitive advantage against other tribes who did not have horses, so not only could they kill buffalo better, they could kill other human beings better too. But there's also some food that traveled from the west to the east. The Mesoamericans introduced some very important food items to the Europeans. For example, you had cacao, also maize, which is a kind of corn, and potatoes, which is a kind of potato. And when these were introduced to Europeans, it led to an expanded diet and, more importantly, massive population growth. All right, now let's look at the Colombian Exchange in terms of agriculture and labor. Now, even though the first European explorers were in search of gold and silver for the most part, they found that if they devoted these colonies, these new lands that they found, to agriculture, they could get fabulously rich. But there were far too few European colonists to attempt that kind of large-scale agriculture, so what to do? First solution, enslave the natives and make them do it. And this kind of worked, but there was a major problem. Turns out these natives knew their own land way better than the colonists did, and so they would often escape their enslaved conditions off into the hills and to the forests where they would never be found again. For example, the Portuguese dealt with this in their Brazilian colony. They started growing sugarcane there, and it made them so wealthy that when the natives ran off, they just went and cried in a bag of money. But it wasn't long before they got tired of crying into their money bags, and they came up with a different solution. And that solution was to import enslaved labor from Africa, and in Portugal's case, especially from the Congo Kingdom. This solved the problem of the natives so rudely escaping because the Africans knew the land less than the colonists did. And as the demand for sugarcane and in other regions tobacco spiked, so did the demand for enslaved laborers from Africa. And that meant that millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and made to participate in what was called the Transatlantic slave trade. But in a strange turn of events, even though the African population was being largely deprived of its menfolk, The African population in general rose significantly during this period. And the reason is, again, because of the Colombian Exchange. While enslaved people were being transferred from the east to the west, foods like yams and manioc were being transferred from places like Brazil into Africa. And those new foods created a massive population spike. And finally, we need to talk about the environmental impact of the Colombian Exchange. It shouldn't surprise you to hear that the natives of the American continents have been farming for many, many centuries. And they had developed ways to live with the land sustainably. But when the European colonists arrived and grew wealthy through agriculture, they started using the land much more aggressively. And that led to large-scale deforestation and the depletion of the soil. And because the Europeans tended to live in more densely populated settlements, they put a greater strain on the water supply and introduced a lot of pollution to boot. All right, that's what you need to know about the Colombian Exchange. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. If you want me to keep making these videos, then subscribe and come along. And if you want to join the inner circle of Heimler's history enthusiasts, that you can.
Okay, so that is part 1. Our next lecture will be over. Oops. I can get out of there. Our next lecture is going to be over, I believe, it'll probably be over comparing the colonial societies in America. So I'll see you then.